It was an ordinary morning in a small town courtroom where Judge Reynolds sat at the bench, his eyes scanning through the paperwork in front of him, his mind already set on the list of cases ahead. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old wood, and the quiet murmur of the crowd barely filled the air. The low hum of the fluorescent lights added to the monotony of the day. He had seen it all before, the mundane, the predictable, the faces that were as familiar to him as the creaking floorboards in the back of the courtroom today was no different, or so it seemed. Andrea Williams stepped forward to face the judge. She was in her early 30s, a black woman wearing a simple navy blouse and khaki slacks. Her hair was pulled back neatly into a ponytail. Her calm and collected demeanor made her appear unassuming. She wasn't trying to charm anyone or make a scene. She just stood there quietly waiting for the proceedings to begin. Andrea had been to courtrooms before, but this time it felt different. She wasn't there to defend herself in the way that others might. She wasn't going to beg for sympathy or try to argue her way out of anything. She was simply going to allow the system to run its course. The only problem was that the system was about to underestimate her. Judge Reynolds looked at her over the top of his glasses, his expression unreadable as he glanced down at the case file in front of him. A parking violation, a simple mistake, nothing more. He had handled hundreds of these cases without a second thought over the years, and this one was no different. He had already formed his judgment before Andrea had even spoken. He barely glanced up as he asked her to explain herself. Her voice was calm, and even as she spoke, offering an explanation for why she hadn't been able to move her car on time. The street had been blocked for construction, and she hadn't received proper notice. Her reasoning was logical and straightforward, but it didn't matter to Judge Reynolds. He had heard all kinds of excuses before, none of which ever seemed to hold weight. In his eyes, Andrea's calmness struck him as nothing more than resignation to the inevitable, the quiet acceptance of a mistake that didn't deserve much thought. The judge didn't hesitate as he handed down the fine. It was a standard penalty, something that wouldn't cause much fuss in his mind. The amount was reasonable, the law was clear, and he was ready to move on to the next case. But what he didn't know was that Andrea was not just any ordinary defendant. She wasn't someone who simply accepted what was handed to her. She wasn't someone who would sit quietly and let herself be brushed aside. Andrea had a history that was far deeper and more complex than what anyone could see from the outside. She had been a brilliant attorney once upon a time, someone who had worked alongside some of the sharpest minds in the city, someone who had left it all behind to fight for those who couldn't afford to fight for themselves. Judge Reynolds did not know any of this. He only saw what was before him, a woman who had made a mistake and was now paying the price. The room filled with the soft shuffle of feet. As Andrea walked away from the bench, her head held high, but the wheels in her mind were already turning. A plan was beginning to form in the back of her mind, and she wasn't going to let this moment pass quietly. As Andrea stepped out of the courtroom, the cold air hit her face, and she took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the street. As she made her way towards the parking lot, the events of the morning were playing in her mind over and over again. She wasn't angry, not in the way most people would have been. She wasn't furious about the fine or the fact that she had been treated like just another faceless defendant. She wasn't even upset with the judge, despite the way he had dismissed her case without a second thought. What bothered her was something deeper. It was the way the system worked with such predictability, the way it failed to see the people caught in its gears, the way it overlooked the individuals who had been ignored for so long. And she was starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, it was time to do something about it. As she walked toward her car, she heard a voice calling her name. Andrea turned to see Charles Green, approaching, a friendly face from her past. He was a lawyer from the old days, someone who had worked alongside her when she was still practicing law, before everything changed. His tall frame and easy smile were familiar and comforting, but it was his eyes that always made her feel like he saw through the facade. The small talk, the pretensions, the things people didn't want to acknowledge, the kind of person who could look at her and know she was more than she seemed. Charles raised an eyebrow as he closed the distance between them, his eyes scanning her face. "Are you okay?" he asked with genuine concern. Andrea offered a smile, but it was thin, barely there. "Yeah, I'm fine, just another day in court," she replied. But Charles wasn't convinced. He could tell something was off, even if she wasn't saying it out loud. He had known Andrea long enough to know when something was weighing on her mind. And this wasn't just about a parking ticket. He could see it in her eyes, that same fire, that had once burned so brightly when she had been a force in the courtroom, the Andrea who had been unrelenting when it came to justice was still there. He could sense it now. "So what happened?" he asked gently. "I thought you would have fought it." Andrea shook her head slowly. "No point in making a scene," she said, her voice calm and controlled. But beneath the surface, Charles could hear the layers of emotion she was trying to suppress. "It's not about the fine," she added after a moment of silence. "It's about something bigger than that, something that's been on my mind for a long time." Charles raised an eyebrow, now intrigued. "What do you mean?" Andrea hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much to reveal. She had always been careful about what she shared with others, not because she didn't trust them, but because she didn't want to burden them with her thoughts. But she knew Charles would understand. There was no one else who had seen her rise and fall in the legal world the way he had. Maybe he was the right person to talk to about what she had been planning for a long time. She took a deep breath and finally spoke. "It's about the system, Charles," she said quietly. "It's broken. It's always been broken. And I've been watching people suffer. Because of it, I can't just sit by anymore. I need to do something to change it." Charles stood there for a moment as he processed her words, his expression thoughtful. Andrea Williams had always been a woman of action. Even when she had stepped away from the courtroom to focus on social justice work, no one doubted her skills, but hearing her speak like this made it clear that she wasn't done with the legal world, not by a long shot. He smiled faintly. "I knew there was more to this case than meets the eye," he said. "You always were the one who saw things differently." Andrea returned the smile, but it wasn't one of joy. It was the smile of someone who had just made a decision that would change everything. She didn't know how it would unfold or how long it would take. But one thing was clear: she wasn't going to let this moment slip by without doing something about it. As Andrea sat in her car, the engine idling as the parking lot faded into the distance, her mind drifted back to another time, another life. A life that seemed so far away now. She could still remember the hum of city traffic, the bright lights of downtown, and the towering glass buildings that had been her world. Once, not too long ago, Andrea Williams had been one of the brightest young attorneys in the city. She had excelled at everything she touched. From the moment she had entered law school, she had been a force to be reckoned with, sharp, relentless, and determined. Her professors had loved her for her brilliance, and her peers had admired her ambition. The legal world had promised her a future filled with high-profile cases, lucrative deals, and a prestigious career that would skyrocket her to the top. And for a while, that's exactly what happened. Andrea had worked at one of the city's top firms, rubbing elbows with powerful clients and successful lawyers. She had been part of high-stakes cases, fighting fiercely for her clients and winning battles that seemed impossible to others. She was on track to become a partner before the age of 35. The money, the accolades, the recognition, everything she had worked for was within her grasp. But the closer she came to achieving her goals, the more the glitz and glamour of her career began to feel hollow. It was like living in a world of glass walls, where everything was shiny on the outside but empty inside. She began to ask herself a question that she could no longer ignore. Was this truly what she wanted? The turning point had come on a cold winter evening when she received the phone call that changed her life forever. Her younger brother, Marcus, had been wrongfully convicted of a crime he didn't commit. It wasn't the first time that someone had been unjustly imprisoned, but it was the first time it had happened to someone she loved. The case had been a nightmare, muddled by corruption, racial bias, and a system that seemed more interested in maintaining its status quo than in seeking true justice. Andrea had fought tirelessly to get her brother released, using every legal trick and every resource at her disposal. But it hadn't been enough. The system had failed them both. And in the wake of that failure, something inside Andrea had broken. The bright future she had once dreamed of now felt like a distant memory. The anger and frustration she felt after Marcus's wrongful conviction pushed her to leave her high-paying job and step away from the corporate world. She walked away from her career to become an advocate for justice, dedicating her life to the causes that mattered the most to her. But it wasn't an easy decision. Andrea knew that stepping away from the world she had worked so hard to build would come with sacrifices. She had given up prestige, money, and the security of a comfortable life. In exchange, she found herself fighting battles that were often invisible, working in the shadows to help those who had been forgotten by the system. Despite the change in her path, Andrea had never lost the legal mind that had made her so successful in the first place. She had a rare combination of intelligence, intuition, and determination. But the life she had chosen, working with the underprivileged, fighting for the voiceless, had kept her away from the spotlight. Her name wasn't one that appeared in the news anymore, and her face wasn't one that people recognized when they walked into a courtroom. Yet, Andrea's mind remained sharp, and her ability to strategize and think critically was unmatched. Today, as she sat in her car, reflecting on the fine she had just received, Andrea realized that the time had come for her to use that mind again, not just to the cases that were small and personal, but for something larger, something that could challenge the very system that had hurt her and so many others. She had the knowledge, the experience, and the quiet power to make a difference. It was time for her to step back into the light. She wasn't finished with the legal world, not by a long shot. And now, it seemed, the world was about to see just how much she had left to offer. The days following Andrea's court appearance were filled with a quiet energy, a simmering tension beneath the surface of her everyday life. While the world continued as usual, Andrea's thoughts rarely strayed far from the courtroom. She didn't see herself as a victim, but there was something deeply unsettling about the way her case had been handled. It wasn't about the fine itself. It was about the system that had handed it to her so easily. Judge Reynolds, in his casual dismissal, had reinforced a harsh reality that Andrea had seen time and time again. For people like her, the legal system wasn't built for fairness. It was built to maintain power. Her mind kept returning to the same question. What could she do about it? Andrea wasn't about to stage a public protest or make a big scene. She knew that wasn't the way forward. Instead, she started researching, digging deeper into the law, not just as a former lawyer, but as a reformer. She began combing through cases similar to hers, tracking legal precedents, and finding patterns in the decisions of local judges. The more she dug, the more the cracks in the system began to show, small things that added up to something far more sinister. It wasn't just her case. It was countless others like it, where the law was twisted or bent to fit a narrative that only served the powerful. Andrea realized that her quiet acceptance of the fine had been an entry point, a way to gain attention without throwing herself into the spotlight. While she worked in the background, Charles Green, her old friend and the lawyer who had been the first to understand that something bigger was at play, started to catch wind of the deeper layers of Andrea's investigation. He was just as intrigued as she was by what was emerging, and soon enough, their conversations began to take a more serious turn. Andrea confided in him, revealing the full scope of what she had uncovered. "There's a pattern here, Charles," she said one evening as they sat together at a local cafe, the soft clink of coffee cups filling the brief silences between them. "It's not just about the fines or the parking tickets or the small-time stuff. It's the way the system punishes the vulnerable, the disenfranchised, the ones who don't have the means to fight back. It's a machine, and I've been watching it grind people down for years." Charles listened intently, his brow furrowed in thought. He had always known Andrea to be sharp, to see things others missed, but hearing her speak this way, with such conviction, made him realize that she wasn't just a lawyer anymore. She was a force. "You're right," Charles said, his voice thoughtful. "But what's the end game? What's the play here?" Andrea's eyes were steady, her voice unwavering. "We're going to expose it, not just with my case, but with every case that's been handled unfairly. I'm going to gather evidence, bring in experts, and push for a review of the whole system, not just locally, but statewide, maybe even nationally. But it needs to be done carefully. No one can see this coming." The plan was taking shape, a quiet storm brewing behind closed doors. Andrea wasn't out for personal revenge. She didn't want to be seen as a martyr. What she wanted was to ignite a conversation, one that was long overdue, and to force the system to reckon with its flaws. Her voice, though soft and measured, was becoming sharper, more focused, and more dangerous to those who had spent their careers upholding a system that overlooked the most vulnerable. As Andrea continued her work, the whispers in town grew. some people started to take notice, although no one could yet see the magnitude of what Andrea was preparing to unleash. The quiet, unassuming woman who had walked into that courtroom weeks ago, resigned to a minor fine, was quickly transforming into a figure whose legal prowess and unwavering determination were about to turn everything upside down. The storm was coming, and no one, least of all Judge Reynolds, was prepared for what Andrea had in store. The weeks that followed were a blur of research, meetings, and careful planning. Andrea was no longer the quiet woman who had merely accepted the parking fine. She had stepped back into the legal world, not as the lawyer who played by the rules, but as a determined reformer intent on making a difference. Her small-scale investigation grew into something larger as she found patterns not just in her case, but in dozens of others. Cases that had been dismissed too easily, cases where the most vulnerable had been penalized unfairly. But Andrea knew she couldn't do it alone. To truly bring about change, she would need to build a coalition, one that would give her plan the credibility and strength it needed. That was where Charles came in. A lawyer by profession, but a realist at heart, Charles understood the power of alliances, of building trust, and of playing the long game. He knew that Andrea's idea wasn't just a crusade for justice, it was a challenge to the very foundation of a broken system. He was on board from the start, but they both understood that they needed more than just their legal minds. They needed people who were willing to take risks, to go against the grain, and to speak out even when it wasn't popular. The first ally they found was Clara Thompson, a former district attorney who had been disillusioned with the system for years. Clara was a no-nonsense type of woman, a force in her own right, and while she had left her position years ago, she had kept her connections with people in power. She had seen firsthand how the justice system could be manipulated for the benefit of the wealthy and well-connected, and her desire to change it had led her down a path of public advocacy. When Andrea reached out, Clara didn't hesitate to join forces. The two women had mutual respect for each other's work and shared the same vision: to make the system work for everyone, not just those with the resources to navigate it. Together, the three of them, Andrea, Charles, and Clara, began to build their case. Andrea continued to dig into the specifics of legal cases, finding inconsistencies in the way fines were imposed, investigating discrepancies in how judges handled certain cases, and identifying patterns of racial and socioeconomic bias. Clara used her connections to gather data from local law enforcement, the city clerk's office, and other sources that were willing to help, even if it meant stepping outside the bounds of tradition. Charles, ever the strategist, began quietly reaching out to other attorneys and activists who might lend their support when the time was right. Despite the mounting work, Andrea knew that their most crucial step would be presenting their findings to the public. They had to do it carefully, for the system they were trying to change would not go down without a fight. They would need to have their evidence airtight, their arguments clear, and their allies in position. It was a tightrope walk, and every move had to be calculated. As they prepared to take their first public step, Andrea met with Charles one evening, the weight of their upcoming decision hanging heavily in the air. She knew the risks involved. She knew that exposing the flaws of the system meant putting herself in the crosshairs of powerful people, but there was no turning back now. "I've been thinking," Andrea said quietly as they sat in the quiet of the office, papers scattered around them. "This is bigger than I ever imagined, but I believe we can make it work. I believe we can change something." Charles looked at her, a rare seriousness in his eyes. "We'll do it together, Andrea. But remember, this isn't just your fight anymore. We're all in this." Andrea nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She wasn't alone anymore. They had formed something bigger than planned. They had built a movement. The groundwork was in place. Now they would take the first step to make the world see what had been hidden for far too long. The first public move was always the hardest. Andrea knew that once the truth was out there would be no going back. Her team had gathered the evidence, crafted a compelling argument, and prepared themselves for the inevitable fallout. But none of them could predict just how quickly things would start to unravel once they pulled the trigger. It wasn't just a matter of revealing corruption or bias. It was about shaking the very foundation of the system that had been built to serve the few at the expense of the many. The night before their public reveal, Andrea sat alone in her small apartment, reviewing the files once again. The weight of the decision sat heavily on her shoulders. She knew that this fight would have personal consequences. It always did. She had already sacrificed the career she had once worked so hard to build. Now she was about to risk everything once more. But as she looked at the stack of documents in front of her, a feeling of determination washed over her. She wasn't going to back down now. She couldn't. Not after everything she had seen, everything she had learned. The next morning, Andrea, Charles, and Clara met in a small conference room at a local community center. The tension in the air was palpable, each of them aware of the magnitude of what they were about to do. Clara had reached out to several local journalists, trusted individuals who had a history of exposing injustice without fear of reprisal. The media would be her first platform, but Andrea knew that the reach of a few journalists would be just the beginning. The real battle would be in the courtroom, where they would have to face a legal system that would fight tooth and nail to maintain its power. As the first article went live, Andrea felt a mix of relief and dread. The headline read, "Local Legal System Under Scrutiny. Hidden Biases and Unjust Practices Exposed." The story detailed a series of cases that Andrea's team had uncovered, showcasing the patterns of racial bias, wrongful fines, and unjust sentencing. The article was thorough, providing specific examples and hard-hitting evidence of how the system had been systematically rigged against the poor and minorities. Andrea's own case was included, but it was framed not as an isolated incident, but as a symptom of a much larger problem. Within hours, the article went viral. Social media exploded with comments and reposts, some in support, others in outrage. The public response was intense, but what caught Andrea's attention most was the way it triggered a wave of reactions from other people who had been wronged by the system. They began to come forward with their own stories, offering testimonies of unfair fines, biased court rulings, and unjust treatment by the legal system. Andrea's quiet, well-planned reveal had opened a floodgate of frustration and anger. But with the increased attention came heightened risk. The backlash was swift and severe. Local officials and lawyers quickly began to discredit the article, calling it an exaggeration, even a smear campaign. They questioned the motives of the journalists involved and tried to paint Andrea and her team as troublemakers who didn't understand the complexities of the legal system. Judge Reynolds, in particular, publicly dismissed the claims, stating that they were baseless and misguided, a typical defense from those who had a stake in maintaining the status quo. Still, Andrea pressed on. The public outcry had already begun to shift the conversation. Local protests began to spring up, fueled by the anger of those who had long felt oppressed by the system. Andrea knew this was just the beginning, but it was a start. She had taken the first step in a battle that would take time, strategy, and sacrifice. There were many more hurdles to overcome, but for the first time in years, Andrea felt a spark of hope. As the day came to a close, Andrea stood in front of a mirror in her apartment, taking in her reflection. She wasn't the woman who had walked into the courtroom all those weeks ago. She wasn't the same person who had silently accepted the fine. Now she was a symbol of resistance, of change, and of the unwavering determination to take on a system that had long ignored the people it was meant to protect. The storm was gathering, and this time, Andrea wasn't just waiting for it to hit. She was ready to stand in its path and face whatever came next. As the days passed after the article went viral, the initial wave of support Andrea had received began to face serious resistance. The local media, once a beacon of truth, quickly began to turn. Outlets that had initially praised the exposer started publishing counter-narratives, questioning the integrity of the sources and the motivations behind the story. The legal establishment was powerful, and it didn't take long for the voices that had been quieted for so long to be drowned out by a new chorus of skepticism and deflection. Andrea watched this unfold with a mix of frustration and resolve. The system, she realized, wasn't going to just roll over. People like Judge Reynolds were used to protecting their own, and they had far more resources at their disposal than a group of passionate reformers. They were fighting not just to maintain their reputations, but to keep their control over a flawed system intact. As expected, they moved quickly, casting doubt on her findings, hiring PR firms to discredit the evidence, and questioning the credibility of the journalists who had reported the story. The backlash wasn't just from the legal world, it was from every corner of society that had a stake in maintaining the status quo. But Andrea wasn't deterred. The criticism, though painful at times, only steeled her resolve. Every challenge they threw at her made her more determined to press forward. The people who had been oppressed, the ones who had been ignored for so long, were finally speaking out. Andrea knew they had a chance to make something happen, and she wasn't about to let the system silence them again. Behind the scenes, Andrea and her team were preparing for the next phase. Clara had been reaching out to activists and organizations that had long fought against corruption in the legal system. Andrea's efforts were quickly gaining traction in unexpected places: grassroots organizations, civil rights groups, and even some unexpected allies within law enforcement who had become disillusioned with the status quo. They were all coming together to support the movement. But for every person who came forward, there was another who hesitated, unsure of the risks involved. Many had been burned by the system before and didn't trust that anything would really change. Andrea understood this, but she also knew that real change had never come from sitting on the sidelines. It came from people who were willing to take risks, to stand together, and to say enough. Despite the mounting opposition, there was another force working behind the scenes: the growing support of the public. The grassroots protests, the social media outcry, the testimonies flooding in, it was creating a groundswell that couldn't be ignored. People from all walks of life were standing up, using their voices to demand change. The more the system pushed back, the more the public seemed to rally around Andrea's cause. It was clear now that this wasn't just about her or her case. It was about the countless people who had been mistreated by a system designed to protect the powerful and ignore the powerless. It wasn't long before the first legal challenge came. Andrea had anticipated this. A lawsuit was filed against her and her team, accusing them of defamation, spreading false information, and attempting to disrupt the legal process. The judge overseeing the case, none other than Judge Reynolds himself. It was a clear attempt to discredit Andrea's findings and halt the momentum of her movement before it gained any real traction. But Andrea wasn't about to back down. If anything, the lawsuit fueled her. She knew this was part of the fight, a fight that would not be won in a single court or in a single media campaign. It was going to be a long battle, but she had come too far to retreat now. Her team was growing stronger by the day, the momentum was building, and with every new person who joined the fight, she felt more and more like she was leading something bigger than herself. The pushback was fierce, but Andrea was no longer the quiet woman she had once been. She was now a symbol of resilience, and with every challenge that came her way, she only grew more determined to see this fight through to the end. The legal battle with Judge Reynolds had escalated beyond Andrea's wildest expectations. What had started as a simple effort to expose corruption had quickly become a war that was being fought not just in courtrooms, but in the court of public opinion. The lawsuit filed against her had put a target on her back, but Andrea was no stranger to adversity. In fact, she was beginning to understand something vital about herself. This fight wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had been pushed aside, ignored, and trampled by a system built to favor the powerful. As the days turned into weeks, the pressure only mounted. Andrea found herself at the center of a storm of media coverage, both supportive and hostile. Her phone rang incessantly, with calls from journalists, activists, and individuals wanting to share their stories. Some were angry, others desperate, but they all had one thing in common. They had been wronged, and they wanted their voices heard. One night, while preparing for another court hearing, Andrea received an unexpected message. It was from a former colleague, now a high-ranking public official who had been in the know about the inner workings of the legal system. He had seen how the judicial system was bending the law to its will, how the powerful often used the courts to keep the disenfranchised in their place. This official had been watching Andrea's efforts from afar, and now he was ready to help. The message was clear. He had documents, confidential information that would be the final blow to the corruption Andrea had been fighting against. Andrea didn't hesitate. She knew that this was the opportunity she had been waiting for. The documents contained evidence of systematic manipulation, how certain judges, including Judge Reynolds, had been receiving bribes in exchange for favorable rulings. There were phone records, financial statements, and insider testimonies that connected the dots between local politicians, law enforcement officials, and members of the judiciary. It was explosive information, the kind that could take down an entire network of corrupt individuals. With Clara and Charles at her side, Andrea worked tirelessly to verify the information and prepare it for release. They knew that this could be the turning point in the case, the evidence that would tip the scales of justice in their favor. But it was also dangerous. The stakes had never been higher, and exposing the truth could cost them everything. The decision to go public with the documents wasn't an easy one. It was one thing to accuse the system of wrongdoing. It was another to have irrefutable evidence that could bring down powerful people. But Andrea knew it had to be done. She had already committed to this fight, and now she was going to finish it. On a quiet morning, when the world seemed to be holding its breath, Andrea's team released the documents. The story broke across every major news outlet, and it wasn't long before the fallout began. Judge Reynolds, along with several other high-ranking officials, was implicated in the scandal. The sheer scale of the corruption shocked the public, but it also galvanized them. People who had once been skeptical were now speaking out in support of Andrea and her movement. The truth, raw and undeniable, was finally out in the open. In the wake of the release, things moved quickly. Legal investigations were launched, and calls for reform were coming from all corners of the state. The outcry was impossible to ignore. What had started as a local issue was now a nationwide conversation about corruption, inequality, and the need for systemic change. Andrea found herself at the center of a movement she hadn't fully anticipated, but one she had always believed in. Months later, as the legal system began to shift, Andrea stood before a new judge in a different courtroom. The room was packed with journalists, activists, and people who had been inspired by her courage. The case that had once seemed so small, so insignificant, had turned into a landmark moment for justice reform. Andrea wasn't just a lawyer anymore. She was a symbol of resistance and hope. But the work wasn't over. There would be no single moment of victory, no singular case that would undo the deep-seated flaws of the system. But Andrea knew this. She had sparked a change, and with that, she had begun to rewrite the rules. As the gavel came down in the courtroom, Andrea walked out with a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The fight was just beginning, and she was ready to lead it.